and welcome to the second program in our 5-part series of Consciousness Central 2018, coming from the Science of Consciousness conference here in Tucson, Arizona. I'm your host, Nick Day, and in this second program we'll be taking an in-depth look at technology and consciousness, what is sometimes known as consciousness hacking, and we'll find out about a VR device that can help the user quickly reach a deep state of meditation. We drop in on the poster sessions and once again get a comprehensive roundup of the plenaries from BEVER and STUART HAMEROFF. All this and more on today's edition of Consciousness Central. I'd like to welcome to Consciousness Central Pattie Maes. Pattie is a professor and works in the field of human-computer interaction at MIT Media Lab. Welcome, Pattie, to Consciousness Central.
Glad to be here.
So this is a field that seems to be in the news a lot at the moment. We're talking about VR and augmented reality and the relationship between humans and their devices, and there seem to be all sorts of issues that are arising about social media taking us away from social interaction into some other world. Let's start by asking you, what's your kind of perspective on all this?
Yeah, so I'm very interested in the relationship that people have with their devices, and specifically what devices are doing to our minds, really, and to our lives as well. And I think it is becoming clear that now that we have these devices in the hands, or people hooked on these devices, really, 2.5 billion of them, supposedly, by the end of this year, it is becoming clear that the effects of these devices being with us all the time are actually not are very negative, basically. They're negative to our physical health, they're negative to our social and emotional health, they're negative for our performance as well. Study after study is coming out showing how just the mere presence of a phone will make a person do less well on a task, will make a person relate less well to another person who's sitting across the table from them, and so on. So I believe, though, that unfortunately we're not going to go back to the pre-smartphone era. We're not going to throw these devices away, despite the fact that we're aware of all the problems that they cause. So I think it's important to try to rethink our relationship with these devices and think about how these devices could basically help us become sort of a better version of ourselves, as opposed to sort of making us into a less aware and less socially connected and so on, and less creative and so on version of ourselves. So that's what I try to work on in my lab. I try to show sort of how technologies that are with us all the time could actually have a beneficial effect and help us with awareness, help us with attention, help us with memory, help us with being creative, help us control our emotion and more.
Presumably, such a device may or may not look like a smartphone, but it's tapping into more internal processes, perhaps stress levels or heart rate or skin resonance, heat, temperature, whatever, these various metrics that you can look at in our physiology. From that, interpreting where our mental or emotional space might be, and then providing some kind of feedback. Something like that.
Yeah, so the systems we built have a lot of sensors to sense the internal state of the person, as well as what is going on around the person, what they are doing. Like the system would know that the I'm talking to another person right now who's smiling at me, and but would also know about my internal state, my electrodermal activity, for example, which is a sort of a measure of how excited I am, my heart rate variability. All these data can be used to get a better sense sort of what state I am in, and also what my context is, so that the device can then help me with whatever I'm doing right now, and can do so in a very subtle and a very well-informed way. But as you were saying, the form factors of these devices are also very different. The hardware, typically we build systems that make use of augmented reality technologies. They really change your perception of the world around you, and even to some extent can change or make you more aware of your own self-perception as well. And they do so by, well, either with augmented reality adding or altering your visual field. They can change your auditory perception. For example, if a person is being distracted and is having problems staying tuned into, say, a speaker that they want to listen to, the device could, in a subtle way, just reduce the background noise and increase the voice of the speaker to help the person be more attentive. But in order to do that, it needs to know that you're struggling with that right now, that you're struggling with paying attention, and that you want to pay attention. And then it can, in this subtle way, change your perception of your environment to help you with what it is that you try to do.
Well, this is extraordinary. And of course, I'm already sort of thinking, oh, well, if you're changing your visual field, say, as we're in this situation now, and changing your auditory field as we're in this situation now, you're obviously having a device where you're wearing something that's wearable, unless there's some other way of doing this, which I can't quite see.
It's typically
so it's
a wearable device.
And so we would both, in this situation, be somehow getting this extra feedback from our own physiology and mental processes, and this would somehow enhance our conversation.
Yes.
And I'm sort of curious what that might look like. Is there any way of knowing how, you know, what it's extraordinary. It's a little hard to imagine. So perhaps you can, you know, can you sort of give added perspective on that? You know?
Yeah. So I gave the example already of the auditory change. We also have visual changes that we make. For example, if a person wants to avoid eating sugar or drinking sugary drinks, is one that I like to use. We can actually, whenever you are staring at some soft drinks, sugary soft drinks in the supermarket, the system can at that moment remind you by giving you a visual sort of unhappy face or whatever would work. In that moment, sort of bringing you out of this maybe very automatic behavior that you're engaged in right now, and forcing you to become a little bit more mindful and think a little bit before you grab for that Coca-Cola can, reminding you of your goals that you have set for yourself. But similarly, we use other modalities as well. We make a lot of use of scent, for example, which is scent, smells.
Smell. Oh, thank you. Yes, okay.
Because those can actually have an effect on people's opinions and on people's decision-making and behavior. But it's, again, something that is not very intrusive. But still has an effect. So, for example, again, if you want to avoid sugary drinks, we could, every time you are sort of seem fixated on, or you're about to reach for that sugary drink, we could release a little puff of rotten egg smell to help help you make that association of this negative smell with that product and make it less likely for you to engage in that behavior. So we're very interested in how systems like that can help us with behavior change, with changing our habits, our decision making, but also dealing with our own emotions and controlling our own emotions by giving us subtle feedback like that still has an effect on our behavior. And of course, it's important that the user would really choose to have these things done to them, that it's not something that somebody else decides on, but that a person would say, I really want to get rid of my habit of drinking sugary drinks. Please help me. And the system, in these subtle ways, modifies your environment to help you with that behavior change.
Anyway, I wish you good luck with it, and I hopefully
Thank
will
you.
see you here in future
Yes.
conferences, and you'll tell us more about everything that's happening at MIT.
Great. I hope to
That's
be here
great.
again. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And that's Pattie Maes. So I'd love to welcome to Consciousness Central on a beautiful sunny afternoon here in Tucson, Mandy Scott, who has come all the way from Canada. Where are you working there, Mandy?
At the Consciousness Research Laboratory at Laurentian University.
And what's your position there?
I'm a PhD student and senior member of the Neuroscience Research Group. That's the group by Dr. Michael Persinger.
Okay, so here we are. You're at Science of Consciousness. You've been here a couple of times, I think, several times now.
My third time.
Third time, wonderful. And you gave a paper the other day or yesterday.
Yes.
Do you want to summarize for us what you've brought to the conference this year?
Sure. So what folks will be able to try out actually this evening and on Friday evening is the very frontier, in my opinion, way of combining technology and the wisdom traditions to support individuals in really mastering the teachings involved in various meditation practices. How do we transform our brain and body, not only to self-regulate, but to access those expanded potentials that we read about, that the adepts have been able to cultivate over years of practice. So what we aim to do in this work, and what people can actually try this evening and Friday with Patrick Palucki, he was my collaborator in this work. It is a neurofeedback experience within virtual reality.
Okay, so a virtual reality means people will be wearing a virtual reality mask.
Mm-hmm.
Can you describe for us what sort of images they're going to see?
You will be immersed in the landscape of your own mind. So what is generated within the 3D environment is a form that is soothing to be immersed within, but all of its movement and oscillation, everything about it is informed by your own live brain activity.
So it's taking brain activity, neural activity, somehow creating a visual image, but is that going to be some sort of abstract arrangement of colors and shapes, or is it a scene in a desert or something like that, or out in the cosmos?
Well, it is more of an abstract experience. The idea is that when we cue the brain with art, then we are cueing the brain to respond more from the right hemisphere. And the right hemisphere is the one traditionally associated with non-dual experiences. So these self-transcended states of consciousness that go beyond the ordinary experience of your limited sense of self and allows you to open up to those capacities that we can tune into more. So if we can cue the brain with art, then you're already sort of ready to begin to engage then with the continuous audio feedback that's letting you know whether you're getting warmer or colder in terms of moving towards that desired meditative state.
And for those people who won't make it to the conference, most of our audience probably, where would they go to see more about it, a website or something similar?
We did have a website. We were too busy developing this amazing frontier technology to really focus on maintaining it. So I guess folks can email us directly, info@myheadquarters.co.
Which, with the magic of television, will now appear on the screen here. Thank you so much for sharing all this stuff with us this afternoon. Really interesting stuff. We will look out for Patrick and the device. What was its name again?
The project formerly known as My Headquarters.
The project formerly known as My Headquarters. We will check it out and hopefully have a report on that. This is Mandy Scott. Thank you so much, Mandy, for being with us this afternoon.
Thank you.
So here in the Art Tech section, I'm with Patrick Palucki. Patrick is affixing a headset to this fine-looking young gentleman here. Something amazing is about to happen. Patrick, can you just talk us through what's going on here?
Yeah, so this is a brain-computer interface. Its use is to learn and train meditation or progressive states of consciousness. But here today I'm demoing a very basic form of meditation. And what this, so basically we have created a software tool that's working in conjunction with this hardware. This is an EEG headset, multi-sensor, and then a virtual reality headset and sound. And what it does is it's measuring the brain activity and comparing the actual activity with a desired state, with a desired measure, signature markers of the state as as found out by neuroscience. And so by this comparison, it's giving audiovisual signals that help the person to get an understanding from moment to moment whether he is increasing the state or not. So it's basically a quantified and objectified form of meditation training, where you get instant feedback whether you are doing it right, and if not, then you get a signal on that, and then you can adjust the modality, so you can adjust the breathing or the relaxation, try something else in your consciousness, and see if you then can trigger the good signals.
What is he seeing inside this VR?
He's seeing an artistic real-time visualization of brainwaves, which you can see here on the wall. And these may change color or change shape, and the environment is also reacting. And that's how he knows.
So what we're seeing projecting on the wall here is what he's seeing in the VR goggles.
Exactly.
And that image is a visual representation of neural activity.
Exactly. Some say biofeedback or neurofeedback guided meditation is great for beginners, but long-term meditators don't really need it. That sounds reasonable in a way, because if you're a long-term meditator and you're used to it, perhaps you may not need it. Sounds logical. But from speaking from myself, I mean, I'm a long-term meditator too, I might not be at it every week for 100 hours or so. So I find it really helpful, because it can be still a challenge if you're busy or in stress to actually sit down and do it. And I find this neurofeedback guided meditation is doing a great way of helping you to do this.
Is this something that sort of the general population can go out and buy at some point, or is it still a research tool?
Well, this is right now still in development. There's at least speaking of EEG and VR, there's not really the right hardware on the market yet, so it's very early. So I hope it comes soon. And research has been done. I think you talked to Mandy, so there has been some validation studies been done and executed, show great results in complete novices as well as in meditators. So yeah, I hope very soon I can bring this to the people.
Awesome, thank you very much, Patrick. Could you tell us your name?
Yeah, it's Swati. I'm Swati Singh.
Hello, Swati. So you have a poster here. Could you tell us what's going on?
Yes, so what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to focus on the reading consciousness of my 5th grade students. So I took all these surveys like where they're lagging, in the field of reading. So I'm actually trying to overcome their weaknesses related to, reading, related to the components of reading, that is, phonics, vocabulary, how to enhance their vocabulary, how to make them read fluently, and then finally reaching up to the comprehension part, how to make them, comprehend different texts, and critically and in a deeper way. What I've done is I have designed an innovative digital curriculum to overcome these components or different levels of reading consciousness through systemic approach, through general systems theory. So general systems theory, basic components of general systems theory is input, process, output, and feedback. So how does it relate to education? So when I start, when you start teaching by following this approach, so input here will be whatever we put into a system is input. That is, teacher will be input, student will be input, teaching material will be input, your classroom will be input, that is input. Then process, whatever strategies you use for teaching your students, that is process. With different material, you execute the things, that is process. Then output is whatever product you get out of implementing the thing out of that process, whatever is the outcome, or the product that you get after implementing the things, after teaching the students. Then feedback. Feedback will be, it'll be based on whatever output, whatever product you receive, according to the performance of your student. That will be the feedback. I actually designed 10 lessons also for implementing on my students. So first 2 lessons I've already implemented and they're showing great progress, but still it's in process. It'll keep, it's an ongoing process. So till I achieve the desired output from my students, I'll keep, just keep going on to achieve that desired output. Yeah, I'll keep trying to get that output from my students, yes.
Okay, and we wish you every success with that, Swati. Thank you very much for talking to us. I am now with Mr. Ulysses Schlosser, who's come all the way from Brazil, which is quite a long way to come to Tucson. Welcome.
Thank you. This poster, it's a proposal to identify the basic elements which, without them, no knowledge is possible in consciousness. So we are looking for basic categories for the study of consciousness. For instance, memory. Without memory, no knowledge is possible, and maybe the consciousness also disappear. So we are looking for that. This is a criteria to identify different categories. For instance, perception also. After that, that's a philosophical exercise, but another criteria for each category, I may try to find a real element in consciousness. And we are working with mental images. For instance, the image of your perception, it is real or not? I consider that it's real for you and for me. So I consider that the percept is a real element in consciousness. I call that a taxon. So a philosophical category may generate a category of elements that I consider entities in consciousness. And both together may generate a behavior, a manifestation. And all that create a perspective to acquire knowledge. So this line is a perspective for one category. If I look for different categories, I may have a possibility, a new possibility to analyze the basic fundamentals for consciousness research. So this frame is written here, Of course.
So this is a system, a method for consciousness, for understanding the...
It's an attempt to organize an epistemological approach.
Very good. Excellent, excellent. Very much needed. So thank you very much for that. I'd like to welcome back to Consciousness Central George Mashour. George is an anesthesiologist. He is also part of he's co-sponsor of your foundation is Center is a co-sponsor of Toward a Science of Consciousness conference. George is a part of the committee, strategizing and helping bring the thing to life. George, very welcome to Consciousness Central.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you. So you also are here in your capacity to present, and you had a plenary the other day. Could you summarize for us what you brought to the conference this year?
Sure. Well, the neural correlates of consciousness as a concept and as a research program have been around for decades. And quite surprisingly, we're still at the phase of debating whether or not the neural correlates of consciousness are in the front of the brain or in the back of the brain. And this is still an active debate. And I touched on that, drawing on some recent data, both from the literature of neuroscience and testing the content of consciousness, as well as some work in unconsciousness and focusing in on the role of the prefrontal cortex, both in sustaining consciousness and its role in unconsciousness, especially anesthetic-induced unconsciousness.
Now, when we talk about neural correlates of consciousness, this is a term that gets used a lot at this conference, and I'm sure there will be some people watching here who are interested in this subject who they hear this phrase all the time and maybe don't quite understand what it means. What do you mean when you say neural correlates of consciousness?
Well, it's used in a variety of different ways. Originally, it was conceived of by Crick and Koch to denote a specific and minimal set of neuronal events or requirements to sustain a specific conscious percept. I don't know if I got the definition exactly right, but that was the use of the phrase. And the thought is, that's an important first step on the way to learning about the neural causes of consciousness, which is what we're really interested in. I think correlates, as a term, is used quite loosely. And the other important question on the table, especially when it comes to the prefrontal cortex, is what kind of consciousness you're correlating things with. And there's a distinction between phenomenal consciousness, that's the pure conscious experience, and access consciousness, the conscious experience that gets utilized essentially by other cognitive systems. And that distinction was drawn by Ned Block. So we could talk for hours about the nomenclature, but I focused more on access consciousness and the role of the prefrontal cortex, but then also not just on the content, but also on the level of consciousness, and suggesting that the prefrontal cortex might be a site that's involved both in access consciousness, but also regulating overall level of consciousness because of its reciprocal connectivity with a lot of arousal-promoting nuclei in the brainstem and the diencephalon.
How do you measure, obviously, if you're as an anesthesiologist, part of your job is to be sure that somebody, your patient, your customer, is out and not conscious. And yet, there's no way. Is there a way of measuring that at all?
So now you're talking about kind of what are the clinical neural correlates?
Right. Okay. Well, I'm trying to tie them together. So, I mean, there is a certain sort of, Okay. So if you're talking about neural correlates of consciousness, then, and if you can identify those neural correlates, then presumably anesthesiology has something to say about that because there will be some action taking place at those points.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's a very fair statement, and I'm both an anesthesiologist and a neuroscientist, and as a neuroscientist, I try to use anesthetics not clinically, but as a tool to probe what these neural correlates might be. Now, the problem is there are a lot of things that are going away when you're going under anesthesia, but there are ways of using it in a graded sense to try to pinpoint what's getting turned off in the brain when you're getting turned off. Now, in terms of the clinical situation, we deliver over 40 million general anesthetics each year in North America alone, and yet we still don't have a standard monitor for the brain, despite the fact that we have standard monitors for the cardiovascular system, the respiratory system, and arguably the brain is the primary target organ for the therapeutic effects of general anesthetics. So why don't we have a standard brain monitor? The use of the EEG as a potential tool to monitor anesthesia, that concept goes back to the 1930s. But the problem is we don't quite yet know what to measure or where to measure in terms of identifying the accurate neural correlates of consciousness and unconsciousness. So these questions, this scientific question and the clinical gap really are very much linked.
Here we are, Science of Consciousness Conference. Stuart Hameroff is an anesthesiologist. He has a quite specific view on what consciousness is and how it arises in the universe. He's working with acclaimed theoretical mathematical physicist Sir Roger Penrose. Do you go along with Stuart's view, or are you somehow in another camp?
Well, the short answer is no, I don't. I mean, I'm open to the possibility of the fact that there's some kind of physical substrate for consciousness, but I'm very much in the camp of neuroscience and more conventional cognitive neuroscience as a way to probe this question. When I look at the progress that's happened in the past 20 years or 25 years in the field, I feel like the progress has been neuroscientific. I feel like there's a long way to go before we need to start invoking quantum physical processes. Now, on the other hand, I'm open to the possibility. I'm actually collaborating with a quantum chemist at the University of Michigan because I want to try to develop some sort of model system to test this idea. So I'm open to it, but I'm looking to see data and experimentation, and right now the primary source of that is from the neuroscientific investigation of consciousness.
Wonderful. So it is interesting. Anesthesiology definitely has a place in the, putting together the puzzle of the science of consciousness, and we obviously will see where it all leads. George Mashour, thank you very much for dropping in this afternoon, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.
My pleasure.
Okay, thank you. I'm here with Tom Bever, and Tom has very kindly offered to give us a rundown on what happened on the Wednesday morning plenary to do with language and inner voices. Tom, tell us what's been going on.
Okay, well, there's a common experience which is related to notions of consciousness or experience of consciousness, in that in a variety of ways we experience what people call a voice in the head. We hear something talking, so us talking to ourselves or somebody else talking, and this is a very intriguing phenomenon because it is in some sense a hallucination, but it may be a hallucination that we actually can develop some understanding of, both how it works functionally but also its neurophysiological basis. So there are three kinds of experience that are involved in this experience of hearing a voice. One is when you're reading silently a text, or especially if you're reading a letter from somebody you know well, you may well hear a voice, and most interestingly, you may hear the voice of the person who wrote the letter, which is quite striking. How we generate somebody else's voice in our mind is intriguing. Another aspect of the kinds of experience that occur is using inner speech to guide your own behavior. When you're making plans, thinking about what's going to happen the next day, thinking what's going to happen the next minute, often it's quite normal to rehearse a few sentences worth of a plan for what you're about to do. Then there's pathological cases that are more notorious, where people hear voices, usually somebody else's voice, talking to them spontaneously, not as a function of reading, but just out of the blue, so to speak. And that is, to some extent, associated with diagnosed schizophrenia. although not always, and also not always schizophrenics have this experience. At any rate, the question raised in the meeting on Wednesday morning was, where does all this internal chatter come from? And what does it tell us about the nature of language and where language came from? So there were three approaches at the plenary, three very distinguished, interesting speakers. The first was Charles Fernyhough, who is both a novelist and a scientist. In his science, he wrote a definitive treatise on the work of the Russian psychologist Vygotsky. And Vygotsky is most known today for studies of how children, like 3- and 4-year-olds, talk to themselves while they're playing or engaged in some kind of activity, in a sense observing what they're doing, but also telling themselves overtly sometimes what they should be doing next or what they're going to do next. This was of great interest to Vygotsky because it fit with the general view, popular or appropriate for the Soviet Union, that speech is basically a social phenomenon. It's transmitted through imitation. The child imitates the parents and others around him, and then internalizes the speech, which becomes an internal form of thought and guidance for the child's behavior and ultimately the adult's behavior. So this fit very well with a view not only that language is a social phenomenon, but that if we can modify or influence the kind of language that people are exposed to, it will in turn modify or influence how they actually think about themselves as social beings. Fernyhough also touched on the issue of pathological talking to oneself or hearing voices, namely the extent to which it's an issue in schizophrenia. And he likened that, or noted that that was associated with an activity in the particular area of the right hemisphere, an area that is associated with activation of interpersonal relations, which makes some sense if you're thinking about why it is that you would think that somebody else was talking to you at that particular point. Rini Huijbrechts from Holland is a serious linguist, that is to say, sometimes characterized as a linguist's linguist, who recently has turned to issues of language evolution and related issues, including the nature of inner speech. He accepts a rather opposite view from that of Vygotsky, namely that the Chomskyan view, that language initially is actually an inner structure, which is a platform, or you could think of it as some kind of structure that supports thought, that is in some sense free of any particular language, and that over evolutionary time, after that developed through some set of mutations, that then various forms of externalized speech took hold, including overt auditory speech, but also sign language. And Rini discusses this as the basic idea, presents the basic idea that the inner speech that we hear in some sense is recapitulating or is an inversion of the outer speech. That is, what it does or how it operates is that it calls on the inner linguistic form, which is in fact independent of the externalization of it in this theory, and that the inner form can actually then be turned into an internal representation of the speech without explicit externalization. So he also suggests that there's a kind of unexpected or pathological relation between the right and left hemisphere in the case of schizophrenic hearing voices, namely the image that he used was that the right hemisphere in such patients leaks some of its influence or information into the left hemisphere, which then gets turned into speech. This and also Fernyho's observation go with a general finding that has been replicated a number of times, that the differentiation between the left and right hemispheres in schizophrenics is actually less strong, on average at any rate, than in normal populations. So there's more opportunity for leaking. Okay, so now the question arises, how does some internal acoustic image that isn't derived directly from anything external, is this magic? Is it a hallucination? Or are there neurophysiological accounts and mechanisms that can begin to show us that it really has a understandable neurological foundation? This was addressed by Andrea Moro, a distinguished Italian linguist and also a cognitive scientist and also a neurophysiological scientist. And what he uses is in cooperation with physicians who are attempting to correct epilepsy in patients with epileptic fits. In some cases, you cannot figure out through normal imaging methods what the focal lesion is that is eliciting the epileptic fits. And so the way that it is localized in many cases is to put a layer of electrodes, kind of a flat sheet that has lots of little points of electrodes on it, on the cortex, and then close up the skull and then wait a couple of weeks or whatever it takes, recording continuously from the patient until the patient has an epileptic fit, and then you can determine where it's located. Well, Moro has collaborated with both patients, and most importantly with the patients and the physicians, and is able to run experiments on the comprehension of speech, production of speech, and so on, while he has the ability to track many of the areas in the cortex. And what he has done is to have these patients utter two kinds of materials. One is isolated long words, and the other is short sentences that, in fact, in terms of length, are the same length as the long words. So they're told what to say, or they're given a text that tells them what to say out loud. But then he measures what's going on inside the areas that he can measure. And what he found is a really astounding result. It's published in one of the most important journals in the world, because it's so astounding, is that shortly before somebody is going to utter either a word or a short sentence, there's actually an acoustic image that is measurable, and you can detect it in the major speech area of the brain, which is really quite astounding. So the person hasn't said anything yet out loud, and yet there is an acoustic representation of what the person is going to say. And so that's very interesting from the standpoint of a theory that says that there's an inner language that has to find its externalization, which is much of the Chomskyan view. But it also, aside from that general theoretical implication, tells us that there really is a mechanism for generating an acoustic image of what you're going to say internally without your actually saying it. It still leaves open the intriguing question that I mentioned at the beginning. When I read a letter from my mother, who died a number of years ago, and I hear her voice, what am I doing there? I'm not generating something I'm going to say. I'm generating something on her behalf, and in some cases it can be a letter that I've just found in family archives that I've never read before, and in that sense also never heard before. That, I think, still needs more profound explanation.
Tom, that's a very intriguing set of presentations on a very intriguing subject. Thank you very much for relaying that to us this afternoon. Thanks a lot. That's Tom BEVER. We did hear from Tom BEVER a little earlier about the first plenary, but for the second plenary, Stuart, what went on there?
It was cognitive and consciousness enhancement technology, with two speakers from different areas. The first was Pattie Maes from the MIT Media Lab, a very famous institution, part of MIT. And they've been leaders for many, many years in technology of all different kinds, and in particular in cognitive enhancement. Pattie gave a very fascinating, entertaining talk about different technologies that are used to augment cognition and consciousness. For example, you go to the supermarket and you wear these glasses, and when you look at a product, it reads the label and it tells you about the product, and it even gives you feedback of whether it's healthy or not, and gives you some kind of signal, no, you don't want that. So if you're looking at too many donuts, it'll put a picture of an obese person. Or something, some of them even have smell that gives you a noxious odor if you're looking at something unhealthy. Things of this nature, but also more mundane things. And it was interesting, and Pattie's been a leader in this for years. She came out of the AI business and now is into this cognitive gadgetry, which is a very, very fascinating and important area. And she was followed by Stephen Gullins, who is a entrepreneur, inventor, former academician who has been working in genetic development. And for example, what if we're able to augment genes using CRISPR technology or something like that, what genes would you augment, would you change, would you evolve to improve consciousness, to improve cognition? And he talked about that. He talked about other areas of AI and where that's going. So the two were kind of complementary, different approaches, one gadgetry and one more genetic, on how we can improve cognition and consciousness to accelerate evolution. It was quite interesting. I was, of course, thinking that to augment cognition consciousness genetically, you might want to work on the microtubule-associated proteins. This is my bias, of course, because everybody has microtubules, but if you go from the highest apes up to us, the big leap is an acceleration in the diversity of microtubule-associated proteins, which are the things that connect microtubules and do different things. It's kind of like everybody has an iPhone, but certain people might have 2 or 3 apps like me they can barely use, and other people might have 100 apps and they can run the world from their phone. So that's kind of the difference. We all have microtubules, but we, as opposed to lower animals, have more microtubule-associated protein diversity.
Great. And of course, I should point out that we did have a really great interview with Pattie Maes, and hopefully we'll have that in this program.
Yeah. And she and her students did a great workshop, a hands-on, interactive participatory workshop that was packed. That was on Tuesday morning.
This whole AI, consciousness hacking, the convergence of technology and consciousness seemed to be a big theme this year.
Yeah, we've had brain stimulation technology. We had a session last year with stimulating the brain with electrical stimulation, magnetic stimulation, photons, and ultrasound. We had four speakers. This year we had an exhibit and a talk about photons and some other stuff on ultrasound. And these technologies are moving along, and we'll see where that goes.
Excellent. And that was plenary 6, I think, yes?
Plenary 4, I think, Wednesday, the second session Wednesday. And that was followed in the afternoon by the neural correlates of consciousness session, led off by George Mashour. And his talk was about, and the neural correlates of consciousness, of course, tell us where in the brain consciousness happens, and also when and how. How is the hard problem. But George mainly focused on front of the brain versus the back of the brain. The higher order thought theory of consciousness, HOT theory, is the idea that consciousness depends on the front of the brain, the executive cortex, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, prefrontal cortex in general. Other people like Christoph Koch and maybe Tononi think it comes from the posterior cortical hot zones. And what appears to be happening is that sensory information, at least for sensory consciousness, goes into the thalamus and then is broadcast, in the case of vision, to the back of the brain, and then feed forward to the front of the brain, and then feed back to different areas throughout the brain. And George has done some wonderful work with his group showing that anesthesia, which selectively erases consciousness, sparing non-conscious activities, only affects that third wave. And why that is a mystery, because the neurophysiology and the neurotransmitters, everything else is the same. So what's so special about this third wave? That's an interesting factor. And there's been this debate back and forth. He and Hak-Wan Lau are on the side of the prefrontal cortex, along with the higher order thought philosophy group. Other people like Christoph, I think it occurs in the back of the brain, the cortical hot zones, and or it could be both, or it could be here, there at different times. I kind of think the consciousness might move around the brain. When you're in a sensory, like a visual mode, you have more visual. If you're in auditory, more auditory. If you're in a limbic emotional, there's more limbic. I think of it as kind of an envelope of quantum activity moving around the brain. So we'll see. But it was a very interesting and excellent talk by George about front versus back, and he brought in the anesthesia affecting only the third wave.
Okay, and who else was in that plenary?
The second speaker was Yan Zhu from University of Pittsburgh in the anesthesia department, and he talked about his percolation model, that consciousness kind of percolates up from the brainstem into the cortex. So rather than front to back, he was talking about bottom up. Of course, bottom up could be anatomical from the brain, spinal cord, brainstem up into the cortex. I think a bottom up and top down is also being scalar in any particular area, scale. So you go from the large to the small, from the slow to the fast as you go downward in scale. So he talked about that and brought in stuff from anesthesia. The third speaker was Marin Vernet from NIH, who showed some very interesting work in visual consciousness and concluded that consciousness is not so much a continuum, but is a sequence of discrete events. And that's consistent with a lot of ideas, especially going back to Whitehead, that consciousness is a sequence of occasions of experience. So that kind of brought neurophysiology back to philosophy. And so it was a very interesting session on the neural correlates of consciousness.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that roundup, Stuart. And that's it for this second program in our 2018 series. Don't forget, there's plenty more to enjoy. Another 3 programs talking about artificial intelligence, evolution, psychedelics, and much more. Until then, this is Nick Day saying don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Thank you for watching, and goodbye for now.